The strength of the anarchists, there are anarchist groups. Like, for example, we shared an office space with an anarchist group that's called Red Tinku. As far as like having a major influence in the peasant and workers organizations, I don't think they do have any influence. And at the same time, I mean, I think that there are, revolutionary socialist influence in those organizations is much greater, just because Bolivia does have a long tradition of actual Trotskyism. Like in the 30s and 40s and 50s, Trotskyism was actually quite large, and these organizations do, still play a role in some of the unions. But for the most part, I think that these organizations are kind of there isn't really a guiding direction or theory behind these organizations. In large part, most of them, would still support the Mas government, but would put forth their own demands. Like the peasant federations put forward their own demands, which are most often much more radical than the demands of the Mas government. And there is a genuine, willingness to take independent action. But at the same time, I don't know if there's a defined, leadership. Some of them are Mas supporters, some of them are more radical, others are indigenistas, indigenous. They fight for the indigenous movement and for basically the formation of kind of an indigenous section of Bolivia, which has autonomy and all that stuff. And so I think it's kind of homogenous in many ways, the movement. As far as Cubans, like I personally haven't run into any Cubans in Cochabamba City, but I do know that there are many Cubans working in Bolivia, and what they mostly do is from what I can understand, from what I've heard, is there are thousands of Cuban doctors in Bolivia, which go to the countryside and provide a healthcare service to Bolivians who've never seen doctors before. And I know there's a bunch of them. I think that it's like what's the figure? It's like 33% of people have no access at all to any type. I mean, there's no hospital within the vicinity that would give them access. I know they provide free laser eye surgery to the peasants who've never seen an eye doctor before, and so they generally play a very positive, progressive role in Bolivia through that work. I'm not sure what other role they play. I mean, obviously there's alliances between Evo Morales' government, Hugo Chavez, and Fidel Castro as well. Let's see. Is there support for the autonomy movement outside of the East? There is some support for that movement outside of the East now. In Cochabamba, for example, they want to put an autonomy a referendum for autonomy on the ballot coming up in probably June or July. Most likely it won't pass, but the movement itself is something which has greatly strengthened the opposition in a place where 2.5 years ago there was no organized opposition. In Sucre, the site of the Constituent Assembly, the right wing was able to basically, technically in Bolivia, Sucre is the technical capital, but La Paz is the de facto capital. All the government functions have been going on there for the last, I think, 150 years. What the right wing opposition did was go into Sucre and demand that the new constitution make Sucre the literal capital. Now, it would be totally absurd to do that, and it would never actually happen, but they did foment a regional battle between Sucre and La Paz, and in doing so, the right wing was able to, build a base in Sucre, and actually, I think there's probably going to be a movement to put autonomy on the ballot in Sucre as well. And like I say, it most likely won't win, but the movement itself has generated a lot of strength in the right. And just to point out, like this idea of the voting forms in the Constituent Assembly, the idea of where the capital would be, or where the actual Constituent Assembly itself took place. We think that these are things. Essentially, the Constituent Assembly was formed by the Congress, the right-wing Congress, the lame duck Congress before it left. And they wrote the new Constitution. They formed the Constituent Assembly in a way to actually to plant the seeds for their opposition, which they obviously used later on, like the voting forms being 2/3, like the site of the new the Constituent Assembly being in Sucre. We think that at the very outset, the Mas government, when it did actually realize the new Constituent Assembly, was so intent on just realizing a Constituent Assembly, because that was one of its main guarantees when it got elected, that they forgot, or they didn't forget, but that they didn't, they postponed the struggles that are very important. Like they should have mobilized mass movements before actually putting forward or concretizing a new constituent assembly around the idea that, no, we don't have to vote a new constitution by a 2/3 majority. That's absurd. It should be a simple majority. Or, you know, why don't we have the constituent assembly in La Paz or El Alto, where we obviously have the huge support and no right-wing opposition could ever enter those areas. But again, those are reflections of the reformist attitude of the Mas government and an unwillingness to actually utilize and put the control of the movement in the hands of the social movement, and instead what they want to do is change things from the top down. But unfortunately for them and for us in the social movement, the struggle can't be postponed forever. A struggle is inevitable in Bolivia. How big is the capitalist class? It's difficult to actually say. I'm not exactly sure, like, as far as percentages are concerned. What we can say is that the Bolivian capitalist class, you know, by international standards, is not like the strongest capitalist class in the entire world. Without, you know, for example, the total support of imperialism, the United States, owners of the major corporations, that most likely this capitalist class would fall in 5 minutes under the weight and pressure of the social movement. And it's also difficult to say because there's such a huge informal sector which really doesn't participate in capitalism in Bolivia in any sort of a formal way. Like they have their own little shop where they sell their own, you know, they scrape by, you know, harvesting, you know, onions or something on their own little plot of land, and they personally bring those to the markets, and then they go back, you know, and they sell shirts that they bought, you know, they roughed up enough money to make a small investment in buying a couple hundred shirts, and they sell those on the streets like that. And so it's difficult to say how big actually is the capitalist class in Bolivia. The equilibrium point for Bolivia, well, basically what we say is this, is that I mean, just basically statistics and also, if you're there, concrete reality will tell you that the workers in Bolivia, the peasants in Bolivia, the indigenous people, the youth in Bolivia, the radical youth, they make up the vast majority of the population in Bolivia. And for example, they were the ones who elected Evo Morales by majority in Bolivia. Now it's Evo Morales' responsibility, and it's the responsibility of the leaders of the social movement and the social movements themselves to get all that stuff that is now denied the Bolivian masses, like a decent living, like healthcare, like education, like food, 60% are undernourished, and that in doing so, they should not worry about finding dialogue and finding and making concessions to this tiny elite minority, which up until now has sucked away all the wealth. That actually, in Bolivia, the poverty and inequality cannot be overcome in Bolivia until this tiny elite minority is actually done away with. Now, I'm not talking about murdering them. I'm talking about saying that, look, we've worked our whole lives. We have nothing. You own things, and you don't work, and you have everything. Join the workforce. Join, be a part of the peasantry. Be a part of the people who work, and let's actually distribute the wealth equally and democratically. Now, our experience in Bolivia and our experience throughout the entire history of the world is that they're not going to say, oh, okay, I'll become their response is to take up arms and violently repress these movements. And so what we need to do is recognize that fact, recognize that if you want to fight for social justice, it's not an easy fight. It's not a fight that can be won just by elections, which we do participate in elections, obviously, but it's a fight that ultimately has to be won by an organized peasantry, organized working class, and one that recognizes the fact that the right wing will attack us, and we need to have defense organizations in order to actually